I'm kidding. I was thinking about this passage from the Psalms, and I thought, the subject tonight is being content. Delighting and content with the Lord. And I started thinking about, where have I found contentment in my life? What have I found to give me that feeling of peaceful happiness? And, it's come from a lot of different places. Last year, must have been last year, I went to Denver and I hung out with my family. And I took my son to the first professional football game he's ever been to the 49ers game when they played the Broncos. I'm a huge 49ers fan. He's 8, so he's a huge fan of whoever's winning. And let me tell you, that night he was not a 49ers fan. But I was just so happy to be there with him because the cool thing, we did not plan this, but I went to my first 49ers game when I was 8. And so it was kind of a neat thing. I hope it doesn't become kind of a rite of passage because that was expensive. But it was cool. And, that's where I was peacefully happy that day. Now, I've also felt peacefully happy when I sit in my house and then the doorbell rings. And before I get there, whoever was there is gone. But there's a big pile of Cabela's boxes on my porch. And I say, that's right, it's Christmas. At least for me. And I get excited about that. And in that moment, I look forward to my time in the woods or out on the lake. And I think, that's going to be good. I could be there. And it got me thinking, if something happens, if there's a tornado that comes through, if there's a car accident, if there's somebody gets sick, we don't go to that football game. If there's some big flood during hunting season, looks like I'm waiting. I'm done. If for some reason algae takes over the lake and there's no fish to catch, that's gone. My contentment in those things is out of there just as fast as I got in there. And I thought, where can I find something permanent to put this contentment? Where can I find it that won't go away? And I thought about another story here in the Bible from Acts chapter 3. Peter and John, they're going to the temple to pray at prayer time, 3 o'clock. It says so. I didn't ask them, And there was a guy, and he'd been crippled from birth. He was lame. He spent his whole life being crippled. And he had a couple of buddies, or at least people that had big hearts, that would take him so he could beg by the temple every day. And to him, that was his life. That's where he was at. Now the days where nobody threw him any money, he got a little angsty. There wasn't a peaceful happiness about that day because he didn't get to eat that day. Or he was a little bit nervous because he was kind of worried about, what about tomorrow? Am I going to get to eat tomorrow? But the days he did get money, the days he did get food dropped off, for a brief time, he got to be content with whatever it was because he knew he was safe. Now, I have this grandmother who had in her room, she called it the formal living room. Any of you heard of these things? What that actually meant is, John, you can't go in there. I said, well, what is this room? Because I would peer in from the doorway, And everything was just perfectly placed right where it goes, and there's plastic over the furniture. I thought, well, what is this? The formal living room, the good room? I don't know about all that. And I said, well, Grandma, what is this room? She says, well, when I have company, I like to have a room that's all nice, and I keep it clean, and that's where we have company. Okay, that sounds like a good plan. Well, I showed her. One time, she was out of town, and I was over watering her plants. I thought, take that, formal living room. You're not going to be so formal today. And I went and I sat on the plastic-covered couch, spent the next 5 minutes trying to peel myself off of it because it's July in Nebraska. Not my best move ever, but spent the next 5 minutes trying to clean all my marks off of it, like I hope she doesn't catch me. I hope I don't get caught. Well, as Grandma got older, that room stayed beautiful. But the rest of the house kind of scooted down the hill a little bit. There wasn't quite as much care going into it because she just couldn't. Well, one day, there was a knock on her door. And there was a man outside. And he had a cleaning bucket. He had his apron on, and he said, ma'am, I'd like to help you clean your house. I know what the inside looks like, and I'd just like to help you clean it out. And she kind of, because, the good room, that's always the one with the big windows to the front yard so everybody can see that it's the good room. So she kind of looked around the door. She said, you see that room up there? He said, yes. She said, does that look like I need help? He said, well, no, ma'am. She said, all right. You just go on your way. And so he said, okay. Now this room sets up the expectation that the rest of her house looks just like this room. So if you're a passerby, you know how sometimes people have these enormous TVs now? I mean, it's like this big, right? And you can see what they're watching when you drive by. You don't try to, but you see the light and it catches your eye and you're like, oh, golf. And I always get distracted. Dang it. Not really. I drive. I'm not unsafe. But my kids, they always look. But it sets up the expectation that your whole house, that Grandma's whole house looked just like this room. And it didn't. Now this guy, this beggar, he's laying on the ground every day. And he saw Peter and John come around the corner. And they looked like they were taken care of. They were okay. And so when they came around the corner, he asked them for money. Guys, a little help? And Peter looked straight at him, as did John. And Peter said, look at us. So the man looked right at him, expecting to get something from him. He expected, based on where they were headed and how they looked, that they had money for him. Well, a few days later, the man came back and he knocked on the door. And he said, ma'am, with his bucket and his apron, he said, I know what the inside of your house looks like. I'd like to help you clean it. And again, she said, I don't need your help. And he said, well, is there anything I could do for you? And she said, well, the lawn needs mowed. It's getting a little shaggy, so you can go ahead and do that. One more thing that spiffed up the outside. And he said, that's fine, ma'am. I'll go mow your lawn. So he went and mowed the lawn. And I asked Grandma, I said, Grandma, why won't you let him come in and help? She said, because this is the room where I have company. This is the important room. The rest is for me, and it's okay. Now, Grandma had a couple of dogs that were also getting on in years. And they kind of did things wherever they felt like it. There were a couple corners in particular that maybe we didn't play in very often. The wallpaper had started to peel a little bit. There were marks on the ceilings from years and years of kids doing whatever kids do in houses that grandparents have. I'm sure a couple of you know about that. Because Grandma and Grandpa are always nicer than Mom and Dad, so you feel like you can get away with a little more. And I said, Grandma, are you sure that you don't want him to help? And she said, no, I'll be fine. Okay. So he finished mowing the lawn, and he gets back in his truck, and every morning he shows up, and he starts saying, can I help you? Can I help you? And so instead of saying yes, she just gives him menial jobs here and there and says, go for it, go for it, go for it. And he spiffed up the whole outside of her house. Now when people drive by, it's a gorgeous looking house. And through the front room, they see this beautiful room. Through the front window, they see this beautiful room. We all expect that that's what her house is like. Well, the expectation changed a little bit. It went from an expectation to an alteration. We changed things. He came up one day and he said, ma'am, I've got the outside looking great. Please, I know what the inside looks like. Let me help. I don't know what it was, but something changed in her that day, and she again told him no, but she went back inside that night. And she started looking around. And all she saw were scars from the divorce from years ago. She saw the dents in the wall from the child she lost. She saw the alcoholism, and she saw the addictions that went on in her house. And she realized that night that as soon as she altered her state of mind, she was no longer content with her house the way it was. She was no longer ready to just sit and watch her house fall apart. Now, the beggar, he asks him for money, and then he looks at him so expectantly. I'm ready for the money you're going to give me. And Peter says, I don't have any silver or gold, but what I do have, I'll give to you. He changes the game. There's an alteration. He says, I don't have what you're expecting from me, but I've got something. And all of a sudden, the guy goes into kind of a panic mode like, hold on, what? I asked for money. This is what keeps me on my cool. I asked for money. And Peter says, in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk. I know what's in your house. Let me help you clean it. So the next morning, Grandma gets up and she walks outside. Only this morning, instead of just peeking out the door and telling him what he can do around the house, she opens the door with 2 cups of coffee. And they sit on her little bench on the patio. And she says, you know what? I would like you to help me clean my house. I would like you to come in and help me because I know that it's falling apart. She had a revelation. We had a certain expectation that was not being upheld. We altered it. Then we had a revelation. We know what is good about this, and we know how to change it. And if you had one of those times in your lives where you look at yourself and you go, I got to change this, and I know how, but I just haven't done it. Grandma knew what her house was like. She knew that things were falling apart, and she knew that it wasn't good. But she refused to acknowledge it. She had a revelation, And she acknowledged it. Now, as soon as she did that, she went out and she sat with this man. And she told him the story about the divorce. And she told him about her life. And she told him about the addictions. And she told him all of the things that she had invited into this house that probably shouldn't have been there. And he said, I can take care of that. I can take care of that. He said, you don't have to be content in a mess anymore. We'll get you straightened out. Now, when she finally opened the door and let him come in, they walked around and she said, see, I told you. I told you. I wasn't going to have you come in while it was this messy. I was going to clean up a little bit first. And he looked at her and said, well, that would have been silly because cleaning's my job. She allowed him in so that there could be transformation of her home. So she could be content in something more. You don't have to keep living in whatever is happening. You can move past it. When Peter said that in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk, he grabbed him by the right hand. And the man stood up, and instantly his legs and his ankles were strong. And he jumped around and he praised. He began to walk. He went to the temple courts, praising God the whole time. When all the people saw him walking and praising God, they recognized him as the same man who used to sit begging at the temple gate called Beautiful. And they were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him. This beggar, this man who was lame for his whole life, was content with that. Because he knew there was nothing more. He was so sure. But through the power of Jesus, is where he now finds his contentment. It's no longer in whatever tiny speckles of change he gets that day, or the drops of food that someone leaves for him. He knows that that's not it. He knows that that's not the end. But the power of Jesus has something so much more for him. I've got to be honest with you at this point. I don't have a grandma with a formal living room. But I have a grandma who's lived a lot of life. And I have a grandma who let a cleaning man named Jesus come in and help with her house. I have a grandma who now does not find herself content in the things she has. And she does not find herself content in the fact that she's got a retirement plan that lets her travel. If all that were gone, she would still be content in the Lord. Because that's where it's at. She's reached that point. And we're not all at that point. Don't feel like I'm making it so you have to be. Because we're not. Because I still feel very content when I grab my fishing pole and I go to the lake. I still feel very content. Especially content when I go to watch football games with my kids. There are so many things I feel content doing, but the biggest one that matters is being content in my Jesus. And making sure that that is the first place I can find it every day. In times of disaster, they will not wither. In days of famine, they will enjoy plenty. This man who had nothing to eat got up and walked. He forgot that he hadn't eaten. He was ready to go. And it's all because of Jesus. Amen. I would imagine we do something after that.